So welcome to our next episode of Interviewing the Experts. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Jess Hawkins. So for those who don't know me, my name's Joel Kirkland. I'm Managing Director of Focus on Workday. I lead a global team of 15 dedicated Workday recruiters. So kick us off, Jess. Tell us about your Workday journey.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So happy to be here today. So I started my Workday journey I think a little bit over a decade ago at this point. I was living in the US at that point, where Workday, obviously, it was a little bit more established than it was here in the UK then. I was working in an HRIS team. We were moving from PeopleSoft to Workday, and for that greenfield first phase implementation, I was effectively the techno-functional lead for HCM, security, core business processes, worked on the change management work stream. So worked on that implementation. It was a lengthy one. I think it was a year to 18 months. That was partially because we did 10 years of actionable history as part of that implementation, which I'm sure people are cringing when they hear that. Moving on from that, I was the techno-functional lead for recruiting implementation at that same company, and then performance management. From there, I went into a much more mature organization on Workday that I was playing in that performance and talent space, being the techno-functional lead there, small scale enhancements. And then I went on mat leave with my daughter, and returning from mat leave, I came into this space of overseeing Workday programs. So immediately off the back of mat leave, I started as the effectively international HRIS manager for a large insurance company. I had a counterpart who was dealing with everything related to North America. So I was everything outside of that remit and running the Workday program for that, which it had been implemented a few years before, but there was a real transformation that was required with regard to that program. And that's how I sort of got into this post-prod space really heavily. Coming out of that role, I went to another global tech company where I was their global head of HRIS and HR analytics. And again, another situation where Workday had been implemented a few years prior, and just based on the way the implementation had gone, based on where the organization was at that later point in time, how they had changed, there was a massive revamp needed of their tenant. And similarly, where I went to after that, same sort of situation, an implementation done a few years ago. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about today that didn't happen, that led to them not getting the ROI that they would be looking for from Workday. And I came in to sort of help support in getting it there.
Okay.
Is that a good background?
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Right. So here we go. Tell us why you're so passionate about working in post-live, post-production, as you call it.
So I don't know if it started as a passion, if I'm going to be quite honest. I think that initial first phase implementation that I did was just so exhausting that I found myself wanting to do something different. And once I started in that space, I realized that I love Workday as a solution. Like, there's a reason I've stayed in the ecosystem for a decade. And it really made me sad that these organizations had spent so much money on a fantastic tool, and in a lot of cases weren't happy with it. Like, we're saying, why have we spent so much money? We're not getting what we need out of it. It's not a nice user experience. We're still doing everything outside of the system. Sure. And I think it really comes back to, I love being able to help these organizations realize how great a system it can be when it's designed and configured properly, and how they can start to see that ROI with efficiencies, automation, etc. So I think that's really where the passion lies, helping these companies kind of love Workday as much as I do. Does that sound cheesy, or is that cool?
I think it's fair enough. So, okay, in broad terms then, what do companies need to do once they go live to get the ROI, as you mentioned, and, love Workday?
I mean, in short, a lot. And I think that's particularly even more true with the Workday launch implementation methodology that obviously came out a few years back, and now super quick launch, whatever they're calling it, Launch Express.
That's it, Launch Express.
Launch Express, thank you. because I think they see this amazing solution in obviously the sales calls and demos, and then they go through these faster implementations or even the longer ones that are, the more traditional HCM implementations, and they come out with something that after a few months of use, it doesn't add up. And I think one of the biggest things is to realize that that is effectively just the beginning of your journey in a lot of ways, that technical go live. There is still so much to do once you're actually in production. And I think it's really important to ensure your executive sponsors, your key stakeholders, all of your champions that you've perhaps set up as part of that implementation project recognize that that is by no means the end of the journey. So I think one of the first things that you need to do is ensure you've got the appropriate governance set up for your Workday program.
Yep.
So if it wasn't set up during or for the implementation project, get that set up as quickly as you can while you still have some momentum coming off the back of the implementation. So make sure you've got that change authority, change board, whatever you want to call it. Make sure you have those key engaged, identified functional or process owners, right? And make sure that you have a clear process for your change requests, how you're prioritizing enhancements, etc. So ensuring that you've got that governance in place, because if you go live, just leave the tenant for a while and then try to come back to that, it's going to be so much more challenging to embed that sort of framework, which can really impede the progression of the program, right? And your ability to optimize. I think the other big thing is the resourcing and the team. So if you didn't, put resources into your HRIS team or look wherever it's located, HR, IT, if you didn't put resources into this Workday team for the implementation project, you need to get some internal resources in. It's just not sustainable, especially if you don't have a reasonably final state tenant that you've come out of your implementation with. You need some people to be in-house to help get you to that point and to partner with the business on the design of those optimization enhancements, getting those configured in the tenant, supporting with the change journey. So making sure that you've got that team in situ. And I think depending upon the level of experience of that team that you manage to get in, and that can be dependent on budget and all sorts of factors, right? You really want to consider having an AMS partner, for example, that you're contracted with quite quickly to help you continue on that journey.
Got it.
Okay. So I think those are a couple of the big things. Definitely ensure that you're continuing that cadence of ongoing review of your configuration, particularly processes. I think a lot of companies go live with what they assume the processes should be, and then they kind of get locked into that. And I think you need to be continually evaluating how the system is working for the business and what potentially needs to be re-reviewed and adjusted. And I think related to all of that, once you have that team in-house and doing this continuous improvement opportunity review, ensuring that you have really strong partnership set up between your team, the in-house Workday team, and the process or functional owners, right? So they can build really strong relationships and work together to drive this forward. Because you have the Workday experts obviously working on the Workday program side, but they don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of all of the functional elements that the process owners would. So they really need to develop a very strong partnership and working relationship.
Got it. Okay.
I think that's a lot, but hopefully that...
I did ask you in broad terms. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we started to talk about resources. Let's think about what are organizations or can organizations do during the implementation that will help once live around resources?
Yeah, so there's a few things. I think first off, please get someone into the internal team who has Workday experience. That can be a consultant, that could be a permanent resource, but someone who has a reasonable amount of Workday expertise. Ideally someone who has worked in a post-production environment that
Okay.
has seen the implications of these design decisions that are made in the workshops and in the workbooks, how they actually play out in the course of BAU activity, right? Because if you have someone who's just gone from implementation to implementation, they haven't necessarily seen or felt that pain, right? So absolutely a time and place for those consultants who are deeply knowledgeable and skilled in what they do. But I think it's really important to have that voice of someone who's lived through that post-production experience to say, hold on, totally hear what you're saying, but just so you're aware, this is a challenge we faced in my previous organization once we were actually running this in BAU, right? So just something to think about. I think also ensuring that your process owners or functional owners have done some degree of the Workday training to have an understanding as they're making these design decisions of what it actually looks and feels like. And do you know what I mean? And I know when I originally implemented Workday at my first organization, for some reason, they didn't recommend people go on the training before the implementation kickoff or like during the implementation projects. They seem to advise that you do it a little bit later on. And particularly for the system admins and everyone, that was really challenging to be trying to make security decisions or inform security decisions when you didn't really understand the way security worked in Workday, right? And it's the same thing for these functional or process owners. You know, if you're head of TA or whomever they've delegated as their proxy for them to make design decisions, if they don't have a fundamental understanding of how the recruitment module works and these different elements that they're meant to be commenting on or advising, you know, the design, how can they make an informed decision? So I think getting resources within your project team, and again, that can be the functional or process owners, to attend the Workday training as soon as possible. That's really important.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, because ultimately it's common knowledge that you want to get someone who's been through an implementation before.
Yeah.
And that's often on the wish list, you know, certainly for us when we're supporting customers through their implementation, finding people who've been there, seen it, done it, and really understand what an implementation looks like. What is less common on the wish list is somebody that's actually supported Workday and managed it post live to be involved in the implementation, because they're going to understand, well, this is what it looks like after it. So this kind of vision for me of sort of starting with the end in mind and looking far out, because it is a journey and it isn't just your implementation. You've got to live with the system, build the system, as you say, align, constantly review, optimize, etc., etc. The idea of having someone who's been in a post-production environment in the implementation, that is really good. I can see the value in that. I really can.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just coming from someone who's, you know, gone into organizations and had to countless times now completely overhaul the security construct that's been set up for HR users, as an example. And having to retrofit that once you're in production is very challenging. That's a major project, right? And if you just had someone to speak up during the implementation and say, really, is that really how your business partners support the business, like on that organizational structure, or is it something else? If you could just get that clarity up front and have someone who's seen the challenges of having to make that sort of change after the fact to really poke holes in the discussion, it's just, it's really helpful from my perspective.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we started talking about budget and what you can do and the art of the possible. So let's start with money is no object.
Yeah.
What does your post-live team look like?
So I personally have a preference for that team sitting within the HR function. I'm just going to start with that point. Every organization I've joined, I have sat within the HR function, and that's because that's a strong preference on my part for a number of different reasons.
Sure.
And so I think when you're sitting within the HR function, I think of these resources as techno-functional. So they are doing the technical configuration, but they are also having quite a lot of functional expertise or exposure, right? They can be, as I said earlier, very strong consultative partners to the functional or process owners. So first off, certainly someone who's an integration specialist on the team, because I guarantee one of the selling points of Workday when you signed on the line was having that integrated with so many other internal systems, right?
Yep.
So having someone who has that skill set and can focus entirely in that space of building your integrations. I think the other thing is having someone who's leading on a reporting stream, because one of the major benefits of Workday is all of that data that you now have available to you. And if you haven't spent time building fantastic user-friendly dashboards for your key populations of managers, executives, business partners, they're going to start to wonder what really is the value of the system if they can't be getting the data out of it. So having those two certainly kind of lead resources. And then beyond that, having those functional leads. So often you'll see them combined across a couple of different functional areas. So talent and performance, perhaps, with maybe possibly like recruitment lumped in, because there's a lot of underlying elements that span those functional areas. Comp and ben, payroll, absence, time tracking, having people in those kind of functional lead positions that have deep expertise in those functional areas that can be really great consultative partners to the process or functional owners. And I think keeping up to speed on all of the enhancements that are coming out in the semi-annual feature releases, being able to leverage experience of what they've done in previous organizations alongside those leaders, just all of that information I think is really important. So again, that techno-functional skill set of having that strong business partnering, consultative skill set, but equally able to get in there and do the configuration. And I think in addition to those sort of functional leads, having some slightly more junior resources who can perhaps execute some of that configuration, particularly if it's simpler but large volume.
Okay.
And then I think you also want people who are working predominantly in the production support space. So depending upon the size of your organization, where you are in your Workday journey, that's going to determine the volume of those resources you need, right, to be fielding tier 1 queries, etc. But I think that's the construct of the internal team. And then I do strongly believe that until you hit a point of reasonable maturity in your program, you probably still want to have some sort of vendor whom you're working with as an AMS partner, for example, because you might come up against things within that internal team that you can't resolve in-house.
Sure.
There isn't that expertise, or you're wondering what other customers have done and you want that external point of consultation. For all of those reasons, I think you still want that degree of third-party augmentation of the internal team.
Got it.
So if budget were not constrained, that is what my team would look like.
Okay. All right. So let's flip that on its head then.
Yeah.
And maybe challenge you a bit more. Money's tight.
Yeah.
Budget's constrained. What does the team look like then?
Yeah. And that's the reality more than right. So I think you still do want, it's all dependent upon the size of the organization, how quickly they're wanting the Workday program to progress, where they are in that Workday program journey. So there's all of these factors that come into play. And depending on those, I think you want, a couple of probably specialist to senior specialist level resources who have a reasonable amount of Workday experience that they can perhaps do quite a lot of these enhancements or configuration in the solution for optimization requirements. And then I think you probably want a couple of, again, those production support resources who can be dealing with those basic queries so that your configurators aren't getting pulled down constantly into basic Workday questions, right? And I think, again, depending on where you are with that journey, what the business's expectations are with regard to how much there's left to do to get to the point they want the Workday tenant to reach, and or how quickly they want to reach that ultimate ideal end state, you probably want an AMS partnership to help facilitate those changes.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. So, wholeheartedly agree. I think it's all about pace and investment, or pace and money, basically, how much you got to spend. And what we've seen is you can slow things down if resource is a problem. But
Yeah.
and sometimes it's a good idea because you're also dealing with change.
Yeah.
So slowing things down sometimes, getting people who are cross-functional, so can wear a lot of hats,
Yeah.
can work really well. But it is the reality, and it's always a challenge. It challenges most organizations, especially in the current climate. So it's something we've got to be mindful of.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with slowing things down, as you say, but you need to have someone in situ who can manage the expectations of the executives, of the stakeholders, and say, appreciate you just spent a ton of money on purchasing this solution, but we don't necessarily have the resources in to get it to the ideal end state that you'd like to reach as quickly as you'd like to reach it. So it's a trade-off. Let us get more resources and we can move more quickly, or we're continuing at the pace that's feasible with what we have.
Yeah, and you start to talk about one of my favorite phrases, which is managing expectations. I think if everyone's clear and on the same page, then it tends to work quite well. So
yeah,
good stuff. So interesting one for you. Tough question. What have you done in your career that some companies might not have thought of?
Joel, after all the years we've known
know.
each other and worked together, you throw me a challenging one. Look, I think I'm probably not going to say anything here that other people who've been in the ecosystem for as long as I haven't done also, right? But I think one of the big things is, especially when you're in a cost-constrained environment and you can't resource the Workday team as heavily as you would like to, identifying those people in other parts of the HR team who are really keen to learn more about the system and engaged in getting more involved, and seeing how you can perhaps bring them more heavily into the production support space than they ordinarily would have been. What simple configuration can you give them access to do that's not going to potentially break the tenant because they don't understand the interdependencies of things? People operations, being able to set up the organizational structure or perhaps configure notifications, right? Things of that nature, which historically I would have always kept within the Workday support team, but there hits a point that sometimes, again, it's that trade-off. And if you have someone who's keen, has been trained up and has an understanding and has capacity to jump in and do some things like that, leveraging them to help support the workload.
Yeah.
And I think, it's really identifying those people who aren't part of your core team, but can support, have the skill set, have the interest to augment what you have within the Workday support team.
Okay. Good. All right. So let's summarize. What are your golden nuggets then? So obviously we've talked about, when you go live, it's not the start of the journey, but it's part of the journey and you've got a way to go.
Yeah.
What are your golden nuggets for post live?
I think really everything that we've talked about thus far, with the governance, ensuring that you still have the engagement of your executive sponsors, your key stakeholders, your process or functional owners, helping to keep and continue to drive that engagement through, continuous improvement activities and looking for ways to continue to optimize the tenant. I think also being really proactive as the Workday team with what you're approaching those process or functional owners about, right? So trying to get ahead of what their needs might be based on what you see happening within the broader business, that as the company evolves over the next year, you envisage this might become necessary in the system, and really getting ahead of that and helping them understand what we need to get to that point. So being very proactive and having that foresight, which again goes back to why I feel strongly about having those functional SMEs with that deep expertise and understanding of what their counterparts in the HR team might be needing or looking for. And the other thing is, and I think it's something that it's funny, I heard talked about at a panel I went to recently, that reporting always gets de-scoped in implementations because of how much work is involved in that. And it's something that I've absolutely seen to be true. And I think the other thing is get some really good dashboards set up quite quickly post-implementation if you have de-scoped it, because that is really how you're going to engage the broader business. You know, they might not be excited, managers, about having to now self-service initiate a termination or a job change, right? Like they might view that as additional work they're taking on that ordinarily would be in HR's scope. But having access that's super easy and gives them a lot of insight with regard to their team, and particularly their whole span of control if they're in the management chain, that's going to be a really great way to get them engaged and see the value of the system, that you can start to gain champions in the broader business, in that manager population, which I think is really key as well.
Okay. Excellent.
That's probably it.
Yeah, well, we've covered a lot. So look, I love the idea of being proactive. I think that really makes a lot of sense. And, you know, ultimately, we hear this a lot, that people want to understand the art of the possible. So sort of driving that and being able to demonstrate what can be done in the system and how powerful it is. And, you know, if you start those conversations early and keep them going and be proactive with it, I can see a massive value in that. I can see a huge value in hiring someone who's been in a post-production environment to be involved in the implementation. Absolutely. Governance, I can see. Look, I think it's just, ultimately, it's about working and making the best of circumstances, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, and the budget thing, it's not it's just a typical scenario, right? There isn't an endless pot of money. I know I joked and asked you what we'd do if you had one, but no organisation really has one. So, you know, we just have to be pragmatic and make good decisions and get the most bang for our buck, as I say.
Yeah.
So, very good stuff. So listen, thank you so much, Jess, for all the amazing insight. It's a real pleasure to have you on interviewing the experts.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. Absolute pleasure to be here.